Okay, you're good.
Cool. So this is Ella Surround reporting for James Cole. Today we are going to talk about the key to happiness in your 20s. Uh, Very, very broad opener. What does happiness mean to you right now?
So something I should say that we just discussed before starting recording, Ella, is that some of the other episodes we've done together are things that I talk about a lot on sales calls or with clients. And so they've become somewhat of talk tracks. Like I can sort of do them in my sleep. And this is something that I think a lot about, but I actually haven't spoken much about out loud. So this episode's just going to be a bit more exploratory, and we're going to see how it goes, which I think is important for our listeners to know. So I just turned 30 about 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago.
Happy birthday.
Thanks. I'm not a big birthday guy, and I'm not a big, I don't like believe in sort of big symbols or that somehow like because I turned some arbitrary number that means something different. But I guess for the purposes of this conversation, I can look back on the past decade and what's changed, what's happened. I think part of happiness is taking responsibility for your happiness. I think there's like a tremendous loneliness in sort of the truism that like there's only really you, that no one else really truly fully can be there for you. And that sounds sort of negative, or people bristle when you say that because they think, no, my mom really loves me, or my partner really loves me, or my, whatever. But the truth of the matter is, from my perspective, that reality is so very manipulatable and subjective, right? That you and I were sharing a Zoom room right now. If we were doing this in person, our experience of this conversation is utterly different based on our past life experiences. Perhaps you had a bad morning, I had a good morning, whatever the case may be. And so no matter how close you are to someone or how similar you are to them, your best friend, your life partner, your mother, there will be moments, perhaps many of them, where your reality, where your conceptualizations of reality diverges. And so I think happiness is sort of accepting that and realizing that A, you're on your own reality plane. You're the only one that occupies it. And B, as a function of that, you get to be sort of master of that reality plane. So you have sovereignty over your happiness and more control than you realize.
And then how does that either align with or dovetail or completely counter how you experienced or defined happiness when you were literally 20?
Well, something I say a lot, Ella, is that there are two deaths that need to happen in your 20s. One is the death of your parents as North Star. And the second is, or an infallible North Star, shall we say? And the second is death of ego, death of self. And so what I experienced most of my friends, and I did this like in the final months of my 29th year, right? Just sneaking it in. But I think ideally in your 20s, sometimes for some of my friends, it was in high school, they were 16 years old, but they sort of realized like my mom, my dad, they may be well-intentioned people, or they certainly love me, that, whatever. I had a nice upbringing, or in some cases not, but they don't know everything, and their sense of reality, their rules, their rubric for success and happiness and meaning in life isn't necessarily mine, or isn't necessarily capital T true. In other words, once you get out into the world, you realize there are other ways of viewing things. And so letting go of, okay, my parents don't know everything. And so that frees up some space to question, well, then what are the rules? If not like just what my parents said or wanted for me. And so then I think what you realize is that unfortunately your conceptualization of the rules in your 20s mirrors often like how you were raised, right? And so you kind of need a death of self where you meaningfully challenge some things that you'd taken as given before. And you sort of kill off aspects of yourself. Like, you know what? I don't want to be a lawyer. Fuck that. Or like, I thought I wanted this, or I thought I was interested in dating this kind of person. And like those things were for someone else, or I was chasing something without really knowing why, and really starting to tune in and trust your voice instead of subjugating it. So I think those two deaths need to happen in your 20s. And I think when I was 22, my dad's opinion about anything or the world or me, or perhaps a step further, Ella. There's this quote I love. I am not who I think I am. I am not who you think I am. I am who I think you think I am. I am who I think you think I am. So the idea is that we all live in our heads and we're worried about our perceptions of others' perceptions of us. And often you might worry that the person you're on a date with thinks you're really dumb, or that your mom thinks you're failing at something, but that's just in your head. That's your perception of their perception. So I'm not really concisely answering your question, but I think it comes down to letting go of your perceptions of others' perceptions, that death of ego, so that the new you can be born, and you can more closely listen to your voice and some of the signals that your body and mind give you.
I want to come back to just kind of the broad strokes of this question in a bit, but before we do move back to that, I'm just curious, to your point that this sometimes happens to people when they're in their teenage years or something. Why for you was it? Are you saying that these deaths, as you put it, happen in your 20s?
I mean, I'm reading a lot and sort of learning a lot during COVID, and I didn't know this, but barely 30% of Americans, of age Americans, go to 4-year college, and only 60% of those who go to 4-year college matriculate within a 10-year time horizon. So only about 17% of Americans go to college at all. I was lucky enough to go to college, and all of the people that I know and work with and associate with and did as well. So I think college is somewhat of like a marker where I come from, and in the socioeconomic bracket and like the privilege I come from. You go to college when you're 18, and it's sort of a coming of age moment, right? If like anyone who's gone to college is listening to this, like you could sort of enter college a child, and you exit college like with some new ideas about the world, and probably a minor alcohol addiction. But it's sort of a chapter and like a rite of passage. And so like on the other side of that, you're born into higher society, into like the upper echelons of our professional strata as a full-blown bona fide adult after that college education. So I think for me that's sort of that's an important binary threshold, that once you cross it, some shit starts happening. But prior to that, you're sort of not responsible for your actions. You're like a child under your parents' roof, right? So I sort of view like 18 is when you move out, and then college as sort of the transitionary period. And then you emerge from that cocoon, a butterfly, into as a 20 something who like moves to a city and gets a job. And that's sort of how I conceptualize the world, because that's how I experienced it. But I suppose if you are in the 70% of our country that didn't go to college, this could well happen prior to that.
Yeah, and I'm also curious to that point too. How much do you attribute these matter of circumstance? It is a circumstance that you were born a white cisgender man. It is a circumstance that I was born a woman of color, a cisgender woman of color. How much do you think that plays into our happiness, especially as our society kind of ingrains it in us?
I think that's an incredibly loaded question, and like there's no way that I answer that in a way that appeals to everyone who's listening. But my conceptualization, and I have to be very careful about saying that like I'm a white cisgender male, and there's undoubtable privilege that comes with that. But I think part of finding happiness is what's called the hedonic treadmill. And I always visualize it as like when you see someone at a gym running on a treadmill, they're in the middle of the treadmill. They could be going a 6-minute mile or a 20-minute mile, but they find themselves in the middle. And that's how happiness works. It's not my opinion. This is like a scientific, it's called the hedonic treadmill. You can Google it. Which is to say, Ella, that like you and I are different. I don't even know you that well. You could have a terrible day. And for me, those circumstances wouldn't bring me down so much. So I guess to give like a more clear example, like, there's a study done of people that just won the lottery and people that just lost a limb. and they ask them to predict how happy they're going to be in 1 year. And the paraplegics say they're going to be miserable, and the millionaires say they're going to be really happy. And yet they both regress to their baseline. And so when you've lost a limb, you still have amazing days and you still have terrible days. And when you have $1 million in the bank you didn't before, you still have amazing days and terrible days. In fact, humans recalibrate in about 3 months to almost anything, barring pretty acute trauma, like really awful things. But like most things, like gaining or losing a romantic partner, getting a promotion, getting fired from a job, the things that most of us would like moving, these are things that are pretty big life events for most of us. And we think they're going to have outsized impacts on our happiness, but they actually don't. Within 3 months of gaining or losing a romantic partner, getting accepted or rejected to a college, getting fired from your job, getting a promotion, all of those things within 3 months, you will be on average exactly as happy as you are today.
So that circles back to what I wanted to ask before, in maybe more rudimentary terms. Like, what are some of the things or experiences that made you happy when you were 20? And how has that either revolved or shifted, or in some cases even stayed the same?
I think I personally knew that I was very interested in people, connecting with people, intimacy, um, friendly intimacy, just feeling close to other people, feeling like I was seen or that I was seeing others, and community. Like those things are very important to me and have remained so. But I think I just like fundamentally mistrusted my voice, which I think is pretty common, like I didn't really know exactly who I was, exactly what I cared about, exactly what made me happy or unhappy. I knew the broad strokes, but I think I was pretty numb. And so the things that made me happy were like going to a cool restaurant or going out for drinks with friends or, hosting a pregame or, like just dumb I was 22 in New York City, and like, I guess the sort of hedonistic pleasures of being young in a city like that, like, chasing a member of the opposite sex you're interested in, or going out with friends, or trying a cool new cultural experience like a bar or restaurant or museum or something, like those things, right? But I think the deeper things, I think a cool thing about COVID is, for those of us who aren't having, a terrible health crisis or a financial crisis, it's done this interesting thing to all of my friends, which is sort of snip off like 16 of their tentacles. Like, so much of us, at least those of us who live in major cities, you do go out with friends, you do go out for drinks, you do go to a museum, you go to an exercise class, like you do all these things and you spread your energy out so liberally. And so when you're not happy, when you're sort of waking up feeling hollow, like consistently, you don't really know why, right? Because you just have this very complicated equation with lots of variables in it. Like maybe it was this, or I don't know, maybe, or you just stop asking the question. But during COVID, when it's like, no, you can't socialize, you can't date, no exercise classes, all these things that filled a lot of my time are gone. You sort of are left to sit with yourself and sit with like a very few simple truths, and spend your time in a very few elegant ways. And so the equation becomes much simpler. And so you get a sense of what happens when you move up and down the knobs. A little bit more of work, a little bit less of this. I've worn like the same 4 or 5 things for all of COVID. Like I would say 80% of my clothes have just gone completely unused. I'm no longer living in my apartment, which brought me a lot of joy. I'm living at my parents' place, working like a dog, and that's it, really. I mean, I was exercising a lot. I've stopped doing that. I'm eating in like a much more regressed, simple way. But I'm happier, I think, now than when things were more complicated.
And what makes you happier? What makes you just say that?
I think just, again, like distillation, like when you have a lot of little things, it's called the choice paradox. Like if you went to an ice cream shop that had 40 flavor options, it's like, this is a true behavioral economics phenomena. If you walk out of that ice cream shop with like a strawberry ice cream cone, you will like it less than if you'd gone across the street and they had chocolate vanilla strawberry or just strawberry and you walked out with the strawberry. It's the same strawberry ice cream cone, but if you had one or two or three options, that's better than if you had 40. So choice feels like it's actually a good thing, and we all want and seek out choice. But the more choice you have, the more opportunity you have to regret your decisions. So the irony of life and how we work as humans is when things just happen and you have no say in the matter, you actually are happier. So it's a bit of a mind fuck, but that's not my opinion. Again, that's like a behavioral economics phenomena. So why do I think I'm happier? I think I'm happier just because I have less to distract me. I have less places to inject my energy and life force. And so I'm forced to choose fewer things and really consider what those things are. And I don't have this FOMO 2020 thing of like, maybe I should have done this with my Tuesday night, or I'm a loser for staying at home alone. You know, I'm living, as I said, in my parents' house, like by myself alone, doing nothing. And I don't feel like a loser because there really isn't an alternative. And so this is just my reality, and I've come to really love it.
That also brings us to the point that you said that humans can acclimate to trauma, reasonable trauma, within about 3 months. And right now we're sitting at about 5 months of quarantine as we know it. What has that been like for you, and how has that shift been? And also, what is it like to observe the way everybody else is kind of playing out the intricacies of those highs and lows on social media at all time in real time?
Well, those are a lot of different questions. I want to get to the social media thing because I think that's like a bit of a trope, but I have an interesting like sort of access to it, shall we say? Like, you know, I've just lived in that world for a while. But to speak to how are my friends dealing with it, how am I dealing with COVID? You know, again, let's just put to one side if you or someone you love got very sick or God forbid passed away. I mean, that's an entirely different thing. If you lost your job and are struggling to pay rent, you know, that's a very different thing. I've been lucky enough to neither of those two things have happened to me. So I'll just speak to my state, which is like just a simpler life where like certain luxuries or things to which I was accustomed was cut off. I'm not living in my apartment, you know, things like that, which are very, very minor traumas compared to getting really sick or losing your job. I have a lot of friends that fit into that bucket. And I think everyone has regressed. Like everyone has less to do and less to distract. And so they're sitting in the uncomfortable phenomena of only having a few things. And so for my friends where the few things that are in their life, like their most important relationship, like the partner that they're quarantined with, or the job that they're still working on remotely, or their relationship with themselves, or their fitness and body, or, you know, the 3 or 4 truths that they're waking up having to face, it's very uncomfortable for people that haven't asked the questions before. Like this is not a particularly palatable thing to say, but I'm just be raw and say it anyway. I think there's this I call it this sort of American drumbeat, like the drumbeat of capitalism, which is like, you know, if you're lucky, go to college, get a job, make some money, pay some rent, buy a house, pay a mortgage, have a kid, save. Maybe you're lucky enough to send that kid to college. You know, you come home, my job sucks, I hate my boss, drink a beer, watch the game, save, send the kid to college, almost out of savings, keep working, save some more, pay off the mortgage, retire. Like that's sort of like the drum beat. And so there's an opportunity along the way to say, I am victim to this. I have no sovereignty. I I am just on a path and I have to be. It's an obligatory march to your death. And I think that's a very convenient way of thinking. You can hide a lot of self-hatred in that by blaming the job you hate or the partner you don't really love or the money that you don't really have. Those are very convenient things to point to as to why you're not happy, and to not take responsibility and to take ownership and sort of governance over your own happiness. But I believe that no matter where you're starting on the hedonic treadmill, no matter where you are, you can make progress. And making progress, little progress, slow but steady progress, if you're starting with $500 million in the bank or $50 in the bank, or you're starting with a job or without a job, or wherever you're starting, just improving your situation and taking ownership of how you feel, and realizing that, my ex-girlfriend gave me a book, and in it was this really cool line I liked, which was like, we think reality happens outside and then our brains react to it. But what if our brains react to things, which creates the reality outside? And as someone who has depression, me, I've been on beautiful walks with people I love, or out to dinner, with my ex-girlfriend, or wonderful moments, quite objectively speaking, and feeling miserable, And so it's what's in your brain that creates the reality outside, not the other way around, I feel. So I think a lot of my friends are stuck in that drumbeat of obligation and like to complain and like to blame their unhappiness on externalities. And I think it's not a popular thing to say, much less for a cis white male to say it. But I think we all, with very few exceptions, actually have more control over how we feel than we realize. And that it's by taking that ownership of self and not resigning that sovereignty to some sort of group identity. I'm unhappy because I'm a member of this group. I'm part of a lower class, or I'm part of I think it's about saying, I have control of myself and I can move along a continuum and become happier every day. And so some of my friends are finding a way, woe is me, to complain during COVID. And others are taking the opportunity to ask the harder questions about what actually drives them and trying to find happiness in a regressed state. And I tend to respect and be drawn to the latter, people that can find strength within themselves.
You just touched on this, and I wanted to come back because you said something about a lot of people just not asking themselves the questions, and I think you just touched on one of them. But what are those questions? Is there a list of them, or what other questions that drive you as you're trying to recalibrate your happiness accordingly?
Well, I think the core question, there's that famous interior designer, I forget her name, but she kind of blew up a few years ago, and her big thing was like, as you're cleaning your home, grab an object and see if it brings you joy or not. Are you familiar with her?
Marie Kondo.
Yeah, Marie Kondo. So hold the whatever, the lamp that you bought 3 years ago for $400, and does it bring you joy? And if the answer is no, then get rid of it. And if the answer is yes, then keep it, right? And that's how you declutter your home. And I think it's the same for life, where, I've had very, very bad depression at moments. And when you're really, really depressed, like for like a week or 2 or 3 in a row, you get eerily sensitive. Like your instrumentation, your antenna gets very, very adept at feeling subtle movement in your happiness. So I'm talking about, like, if I walk into a room that's a little too hot, I'll be like, ooh, I'm a little less happy. I'm like 1 or 2% less happy. Or if I'm like, I take a sip of like a coffee that's really, I'll be like, ooh, that was pretty good coffee. I'm like 1% more happy. Like really subtle little things. And you start to right. And maybe that's a gift that my depression's given me, right? And not everyone's that sensitive. And sort of, you start going crazy a little bit because like everything affects you a little bit. But I think it's starting to pay attention to that antenna. And we have a tendency as humans to subjugate ourselves. So what that means is, you, Ella, let's say, I don't know, this were a job interview and you didn't feel it was going very well, or you didn't get the job, you'd walk away probably blaming yourself. I did these things wrong and I'm so fucking stupid, and like, right. And you beat yourself up, and it could just be that it wasn't a fit, or even more frequently, maybe it was me, maybe it was what I brought to the table. And so I think learning to trust your voice, learning to trust your antenna. Like if you weren't comfortable in that job interview, if you didn't do well, asking why, and not just turning to the immediate answer of it was my fault. Or I guess to speak out of the other side of my mouth, just to assume out of hand that everything's someone else's fault, but to try to really trust your voice and trust your instincts. So the hard questions are like, does this make me happy? Why or why not? If it doesn't make me happy and I have a good reason for it, can I remove it from my life? Do I have the luxury to do that? And I would argue, I think more than most, that the answer is almost always yes, you can remove it, right? Like you think, I have friends that are in romantic relationships. Like if I leave this person, what do I have, right? If I leave this city, what do I have? If I leave this job, am I going to be able to make rent, But the answer is, if you want it bad enough, the answer is always yes. Like you can find a way to cobble together some extra money to make rent and quit the job that's super toxic. You can find a way to go live with your folks if you're going to leave your romantic partner. You can find a way, and there are exceptions that I accept. But I think people are more resilient than they realize and have more options than they realize. So really trying to hone in on, does this make me happy? And if the answer is no, trying to step away from it.
Something too about our society in particular is that we put a lot of stock in being happy in everything we do, whether that's a job, whether that's a relationship, just so many different things. And I think with regards to jobs specifically, there is kind of this counter movement of people who want to go back to a job just being a job, and you just kind of plug in and you do the job and you go home and you find other ways to make yourself happy. I'm curious your thoughts on that, and how much should your job make you happy? How much should you find happiness in your job? Should it just be something that you just do for those 8 hours a day?
I've been really focused on personal finance recently, Ella, and trying to be like really sustainable and just like set myself up for the future financially. And so when you think about personal finance and what you're doing with your money, and like hopefully most people listening are familiar with the concept of like a diversified portfolio, right? You don't want all your money in one thing, because if that one thing goes bad, if it's a real estate investment or something, then you've lost it all, right? So you have stocks and bonds and real estate and all kinds of different things. And I think the same thing is true for happiness. Like we are all comfortable with money as a currency, but what if you took your happiness as a currency? So recently I went on a different medication. I feel a lot happier. Let's say 90 out of 100 as opposed to 60, which might have been how I was feeling most days for a year or two, like prior to this. So all of a sudden now I have 30, it's like I got a raise from $60,000 a year to $90,000 a year. I have all this extra currency to invest into things. And so the question is, into what? And how can I compound, just like you do with money? How can I compound my investments? So, and they're at odds with one another, Ella. There are lots of value stores. Your professional fulfillment, that's a value store. Your relationship with your significant other, that's a value store. Your hobbies, your friends, these are all things that can bring you happiness. If you spend all your time at work, you spend less time with your significant other. If you spend all your time with your significant other, you spend less time at work, etc. And so you can sort of move your money around. You can move your happiness around and invest in things and divest in things. So I think like you just have to pay attention to what brings you happiness and invest in those things that do, and, divest from those that don't. I do think that fulfillment, the act of making progress, the act of challenging yourself and making progress is very, at least for me, very central to being happy. And I think a career or something that challenges you, it can be a hobby, but something that is a bit too hard, like you're not quite good enough for, and you need to better yourself and challenge yourself on a fairly regular, if not daily basis. You like your relationships can do that, your job can do that, your hobbies can do that, but I think you need that thing in your life that brings the best out of you. Otherwise, you just sort of atrophy. In the same way, if you stop working out a muscle, it just dies. I think we die inside when we're not challenged. I think a career has played that role historically, but it could be a relationship or a hobby, certainly.
So should people seek happiness in their jobs?
Yeah, or if not, then find a damn good alternative. I think if you're miserable at your job, how can you find fulfillment? Like, what can you hang your hat on? How can you find challenge and intrigue and something that brings the best out of you elsewhere? So, a reality for some people is you got to work your job to make your money. Fine. So if you hate what you do, I would say change the room, like try to find something that, that aligns more closely to what you're really good at or what you really love, so that, because you do spend a lot of time at work, just period. If you're lucky, 30, 40 hours a week. And if you're unlucky, or I could even invert that, right? I spend 80 hours a week working and I love that. But you spend a shit ton of time working in most cases, unless you're independently wealthy or you have a partner that supports you or something. So yeah, ideally you're somewhat happy, but if not, then I guess you suck it up and you suffer through and you make your money. But I would hope that you have things in your life that are really, really filling you up outside of that. Really meaningful relationships or hobbies that you can't wait to get home to at the end of the day. Or, I know plenty of people that live for their kids. Like, that's their purpose in life. And I know plenty of people that have a hobby that they just absolutely adore. And like, when they retire, they're going to do it all the time. But Gary Vaynerchuk says, living for Friday is like a pretty shitty construct. Like, you even started this today, and I know you love what you do, Ella. And you said, like, it's definitely a Friday, or like, like there's this thing that we do societally where it's like the work week's almost over. Like, thank God for that. Now I can get to doing what I really love. And like, the truism is, find a job you love, you never work a day in your life. Like, how can your Tuesday, whether it's because of your job or the hobby you do after your job, or a combination, or you try a different restaurant every Tuesday with your partner, or you play a board game every Tuesday night, or whatever the fuck, how can you make it so that you're really stoked to wake up on Tuesday or Wednesday or Thursday, for that matter? Like, why does it have to be that the weekend when you're not working is when you're happy, and then Monday through Friday is when you're kind of suffering through?
Why do you think that our society puts such a premium on, you just, for the people who just graduated college, or for the people who are just starting out their lives as an adult, right when about 18 to 20 hits, they put such a premium on 20s being the happiest years of your life, is a thing I've heard a lot. Or that, you're in your 20s, what do you have to be worried about? Why do we put such a premium on happiness in this decade specifically?
I think that's a good question. I think there are like a lot of things that we don't put enough emphasis on. The collapse of leaving college and entering the working world, like, there's a huge fall from grace that occurs. You go from a very prescriptive, controlled environment to a completely anonymized one, where you're like a little flea in a city. And again, this is a very specific type of person I'm talking about, but this is a whole nother talk, but like, higher education is entirely broken. Like, the amount of money that it costs to go to school now, like it's almost tripled in the past 3 or 4 decades. Like, our parents paid like, $15K to go to school, and now kids are paying 60, 70K a year to go to school. I think 50% of higher education is going to crumble in the next decade, by the way. Like, half of the colleges and universities that exist won't in 10 years. And I think there's this lie that you're going to get this degree and it's somehow going to mean something to the world, and it really doesn't, or not as much as you think. So I think there are a lot of lies, and I don't think people are prepared for like adulthood. And as you say, like, you're entering this exciting time of your life and so on. And Then when people feel alone or confused or a bit misguided at age 20, 21, 22, I think it can be very lonely because you think you're somehow missing something. You can move to an exciting city like New York or Boston or LA or San Francisco or whatever, Austin, Texas. And you're like, where's all the action? Where is everyone? What am I supposed to do? And it can feel very numbing and scary. I guess the reason people talk about it being the best time is because you have this nexus of power and autonomy with very little responsibility. So when you're 38, you probably have a kid, or you have a partner, or you have a mortgage, or you're tethered, right? Like you have shit you got to do. You have to. And when you're 18, you live in your parents' house and you have to do what they say. But when you're 24, you live by yourself. You can do whatever the fuck you want. You're making some money. You have a little bit of extra money, hopefully. And no one's there to tell you what to do. And you don't have to be home to put the kid to bed or to walk the dog or to, you can kind of do whatever you want. So I think that's why happiness, people think that will make you happy or something, is that kind of freedom.
To that point too, though, about having children or getting married, we know our generation is getting married later and later. We know our generation is starting to have children or thinking to have children later and later. We also know that because of the pandemic, people are rethinking if they even want to have children at all. And this is very rudimentary research within the past few months, but these trends are already started. So what are your thoughts on the way our generation and the generations after us are redefining what it means to live a happy and fulfilled life?
I think it's good we're asking these questions. I mean, again, everyone has regressed. Like everything, the capital, like coming back to the first things I said, right? Like reality is subjective. My reality and yours in this conversation, we will walk away from this conversation with different conceptualizations of how it went, how it felt, how good it was. And we were both fucking here having the conversation together, let alone someone who's watching this next Tuesday and so on. So think about this, Ella, like everything is being questioned right now. Things that you and I were raised as being capital T true. Capital T true, democracy is good. Capitalism is good. Our political system is good. Our healthcare system is good. Like these are all things that maybe people on the surface dance on it, like, oh, I don't like this president and I don't like this, and our big pharma really needs to work some shit out. But we are like fundamentally doubting big tectonic plates that are sitting underneath our society right now. And then what about the ones right above that you just mentioned? Like, I don't know, people our age are like, I don't know if I want to fucking live in a city. Like I've just been working remote and it's fine. Or I don't know if I want to get married, or I don't know if I want kids. Like these are huge shifts that people are asking. Like you asked before, what are these questions? They're personal micro questions of what makes me happy. But then there's societal questions of what makes us happy. And those questions are the ones you're bringing up. Kids or no kids, city or rural, any number of things, buying a house or never having a house, buying a car or never having a car. Like these are the American dream of old, the sort of like Reagan promise of like everyone having a house and like that kind of thing. Like these are all being thrown out, questioned, chopped up and changed. And I think it's uncomfortable and weird and bizarre and sort of dystopian, but also very healthy.
And I'm just curious too, as people are in their 20s and constantly questioning. I mean, I spent the bulk of my early 20s writing listicles about happiness and about this very topic. Arguably had very little say or very little authority in something that I was purporting to present myself as an authority for. But as we're figuring out as we go, how is being honest about that advice that we're all learning along, is that helpful? Is that detrimental? Walk me through that.
I'm gonna bastardize your question and answer it with a more interesting one, I think, Ella, which is 20 years ago, someone like you, and you're in a very, people don't know you and I haven't given you the chance to introduce yourself, but you're an incredibly accomplished, writer, reporter. You've covered, A-list celebrities and written for publications that would make anyone listening blush. 10 years ago, those very publications would write something and then an audience would read it. 10 years ago, 20 years ago, a news outlet would cover something and then people would watch it. And now, because of the data that we have, we know what people read and want to read. We know what people view on the news and pay attention to and when they change the channel. And so if you're an editorial voice, as you are, or you are a news station, as CNN or Fox or anyone in between is, you have the data to give people what they want, which gives you what you want, which is eyeballs. So this weird shift has happened, Ella, where it used to be, and this mirrors my reality comes from inside your brain outward, not outside in. Editorial used to flow from publisher to reader. Now it flows from reader to publisher. Like, we societally inform what is written about because the writers are incentivized to get readers. And so it's a very, very profound shift that's just happened that I don't think people realize, that the things that we turn to for capital T truth are actually just mirrors. The things we turn to for capital T truth. We used to have 3 news stations 30 or 40 years ago: CNN, ABC, NBC. And those 3 things told the capital T truth. It was what happened in our country. And now Fox News and CNN will cover the same event completely paradoxically to pander to their viewership. So there's no truth anymore. There's no capital T truth anymore. There's just subjective truth. It's all made up. And so it's really interesting. Like, what we're reading, what we're absorbing is just a reflection of what others like us want to read and want to absorb. It homogenizes us and polarizes us. Because if you watch one thing and I watch another, we get different conceptualizations of the truth. So once again, I come back to this idea of the individual and sovereignty of self, that to be liberated from this brainwashing that's occurring. It sounds conspiratorial and ridiculous. I sound like a nut job, but if you actually listen to the words I'm saying, it's true. I think we've all experienced it. And the only way to combat it is sovereignty of self and autonomy over things happen, and I have feelings. And if you can inject thought in between those two things, you can control the way you react to the things that occur. And that's all that matters.
You previously mentioned your experience with depression. And as we become more open as a society about talking about mental health and about talking about seeking treatment for things like depression and anxiety disorders, at what point, given your belief that we control our happiness more than people tend to believe, on the flip side, how often should we really sit and acknowledge that depression or that sadness? Is there a benefit to that?
Really interesting question. I mean, my grandfather just died 2 days ago, and he had depression and was very closeted about it because it's how, he was raised in Hitler's Germany and had a pretty crazy, past. And also was just born of a generation that didn't talk about those things. And on his deathbed, I said to him, I have your genes. Like, talk about legacy and that you're living on and so on. Like, I feel you inside me. And I have the enormous benefit of being able to, right now, I'm talking about my depression to you and ostensibly hundreds or thousands of others that will watch this without shame. And that's amazing. Like, what a gift that I've been born in this age where I can talk about that openly and not be judged, or at least not be fearful of said judgment. Something I really brush up against, Ella, is like I feel so much happier these past few months. I've changed a lot of things about my life. Um, I spend hours a week in therapy. I have 2 different therapists. I work really, really hard on my mental health. But if I lower my medication, I feel depressed again. And I can't remedy the fact that I'd like to think that I have complete autonomy over how I feel. But I don't. Like there's something biological that I've inherited from my grandfather, and it's like, it just is, right? And we don't know much about it. It's very opaque. So I guess I've never really said this out loud or conceptualized it quite this way, but I think like happiness and depression are not at odds with one another. Like I view depression as sort of like a chemical, biological thing, and happiness is a layer that sits on top of that. Like depression and sadness are not the same thing. And like being manic, if you're manic depressive and you think you're, the Messiah and you jump out of a window, that's not the same as being happy, right? So being depressed, which is something that many people, 1 out of 16 in our country are, being anxious. 1 out of 8 American adults have a benzodiazepine prescription, Xanax, Klonopin, Ativan. 1 out of 8, right? And in our world where people are hardworking professionals and whatever, it's probably 1 out of 5, 1 out of 4 have a benzo script. So it's a huge problem, but yeah, I have to think through it more, but I don't think being depressed is at odds, or having depression is at odds with pursuing happiness. And I don't think that you can will your depression away, because Lord knows I've tried. And yet I still struggle with depression and need medication.
Is there a benefit, do you see, to acknowledging a period of sadness that you might feel, like, for example, your grandfather, which again, I'm so sorry about, but just, honoring that feeling for what it is, as opposed to trying to just move on and force yourself to be happy?
Yeah. I think there are healthy ways to fill holes and unhealthy ways to fill holes. Like I remember like really coaching friends on going through breakups in college or whatever, or since then. And, there's a friend that breaks up with someone and immediately goes and sleeps with someone else, or drinks a lot, or like, you fill it with hedonistic sort of shallow things. And then there's a friend that's like, I'm going to go and get a new hobby, or I'm going to go and really get back into running again and get healthy, and whatever the case may be. And I think there are healthy ways to channel some of that energy. There was energy flowing in a direction, say my love of my grandfather, and then that gets severed and I need to like reallocate it somewhere. I think there's a healthy way to reallocate it, and there's an unhealthy way. And then to your point, I think there is something to be said for sitting in the blockage for a second, and just feeling what you're going to feel before reallocating it so quickly. So yes, I think there's something to be said for sitting in the uncomfortability. And then I think there's something to be said for, as it's collecting around your ankles, that uncomfortability, to then rechannel that energy into something positive and useful and productive. I wanted to bring up a paradox for you, Ella, that I'm quite stumped by, which is the paradox of being enough and not enough at the same time. So it kind of ties together some of your questioning. You asked about a job and whether that should bring you purpose or happiness. You asked about my grandfather dying and sitting in an uncomfortability as opposed to rechanneling energy. Being enough and not enough is something that I try to be in one breath. So being not enough is when I wake up and I feel that my company could be better. I could be better. I can be a better brother, son, boyfriend, you name it, human, entrepreneur. And so that's what drives me forward. That's what makes me show up for all my relationships. That's what makes me show up as a boss, as a business leader, as a whatever. But then if you're constantly not enough, definitionally, you're always chasing happiness, right? Something, as you said, we're sort of obsessed with societally. Like it's this elusive thing. It's like when you chase after rainbow, because you saw a Lucky Charms commercial once and you're thinking there's something at the end, but it's not. It just keeps moving on the horizon. So how can you not always be chasing and chasing and chasing this elusive notion of happiness, but instead be enough, and to be able to sit with yourself and love yourself and feel that you are fine just as you are? But if you conversely do that all the time, then you don't do anything. You're just sort of a Zen monk, and you sit there and you're always happy. And perhaps that's a life worth living. But for me, I think I want to let my light out. I want to do things, and I want to better myself and grow and progress. So you have to have room for both. You have to have room for a deep hunger for self-betterment so that you can improve and help others. But you also have to have a love of self and a contentment of where you are and a gratefulness for where you are. And that's really hard.
If you could go back to 1 year in your 20s and give that age version of yourself advice for happiness, which year would you pick? Why? And what would your advice be?
I think I'd go back as early as I could. I mean, it probably, if those are the parameters, I'd say I'd go back to when I was 20. Because I don't think I wasted time or lived a terrible life or didn't, but I think I've only recently started loving myself, like very recently, past like 3 or 4 months. And I didn't love myself before. So I think giving myself a break, being like gentler with myself, I think, these are all truisms, right? But just like trying to identify what it is that I care about, what my voice is saying, trusting my instincts, and not feeling like I'm a failure or letting other people down, or I'm not good enough in some profound way. That's a lot of how I felt when I was 20. And I think if I could go back and sort of undo some of that damage I was doing to myself, so much of my energy was just beating myself up. So I think if I could change that, I would. I think if I could, I'm trying to think what else. I mean, it's hard though, as you say, like out of depression, out of that self, attacking yourself like that, like I started my company out of self-hatred, right? Like I started my company to prove that I was worth something. And a lot of beauty has come out of that, like a lot of self-betterment and betterment for my coworkers and for the photographers we help, the brands we help, like good is coming out of it, right? Beauty. My therapist always says, like, any therapist worth their salt is trying to fix some part of themselves too. So I think, and Robin Williams has this quote about like people that are deeply unhappy are the best at making other people happy because they know what it feels like to be unhappy. And I think, yeah, so in some ways I wish I could go back and try to very quickly, very early. I have a 16-year-old cousin, and I talk her ear off about loving herself and, trying to fix things upstream that I didn't fix in myself. But a lot of my self-hatred and how hard I was on myself earlier, I think, made me forge this path forward and like harden myself. And it was a very hot fire. And in that hot fire, I became quite resilient. So it's hard, right? Like these are all truisms of life. The harder the battle seems, it's the sweeter the victory, or that which does not kill you makes you stronger. Nietzsche said that. So is it good that I didn't love myself or that I have depression? Perhaps, because now I am so much more grateful for my happiness and so eager to share it with others. But on the contrary, I wish I could go back a decade and love myself a bit more upstream.
To that point too, and then I think this will be our last question because we'll be at time. But if, let's say you're in a relationship with somebody, it could be a parent-child relationship, could be a romantic relationship, whatever the case may be. Just because you love the person doesn't mean you're always happy with them. How it is that self-love and happiness with yourself in your life intersect or dovetail?
With others? Well, I mean, these again are truisms. Loving yourself before you can love others. I think really knowing what it is that you want, what it is that brings you joy, and standing up for that and putting a fence around that is a good way to like not resent people, right? If you know what you want, what your limits are, what you expect from someone else, then it's harder for them to disappoint you because you make that clear. I also think, as you say, though, I mean, like, as I said earlier, no one shares your reality completely. And so I think a lot of intimacy is those cracks, right? It's like, Ella, you and I could get in an argument professionally, say, and I could um, try to empathize and really understand your side, your opinion, your way of seeing things, even though it's not my version of reality. You're coming at me with something I don't think is quite right. I could choose to attack you or judge you, or I could choose to meet you with understanding, empathy, thoughtfulness. And if I'm able to do that and share your reality, I can probably calm you down. We can come to some sort of an agreement.
Let me roll it back just slightly. I mean more in terms of, people think that loving yourself, which has been touted by the media as this kind of cure-all, will give them instant happiness. How much does self-love and personal happiness within your own state of being with you yourself, how much do those intersect, and is one the key to the other?
I think I understand the question. I do think it is the panacea that it's touted to be. Like if you truly love yourself, if you're truly at peace, which is really hard, really like again, like hours and hours of therapy a week I do working on this. It's really hard. But if you do get there, I think a lot flows out of that. Like you're more patient with others, you're more understanding of others, you just have so much more room to allow other people and other things to do what they must, right? You can sort of ride further back in the saddle and allow the world to sort of gather in pools around you, and just sort of, that you're okay. Like, that you are happy and content with yourself. And so if you don't get certain things you wanted, or someone wrongs you in a way that you weren't expecting, it's less of an attack because you're ultimately at peace. So I do think if you can be at peace with yourself, which is quite hard, or if you can move towards being more at peace with yourself, you'll find that your other relationships, like other things, will click, and you'll feel more at peace with others as well.
Perfect. Well, we're at time, and those were all of my questions. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ella. This was good. We dove into the unknown together today.
How do you
So
feel about it?
I think we did okay. What do you think?
I think we did good. I mean, you mentioned that if we might come across, might leave it feeling two different ways. So I wanted to check in.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Well, I'm glad we both feel okay, and maybe we'll get some angry comments or something being like, James really needs to prepare next time. But otherwise, I'm just going to show up and let you guide me as you did today.
I mean, you tend to work best with prompts. I will tell you that as an interviewer, you tend to work best with kind of those prodding. So I wouldn't overthink it too much.
Dope. Well, thank you. Appreciate it as
Thank you
always.
so much. Have a good one.